Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Emily, and I'll be the host for today's Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Noble Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors here locally in Washington, D.C., and in 35 countries around the globe. The Hinckley Institute also offers classes, the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences to Washington, D.C., and over $70,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to go next door or to our website, www.hinckley.utah.edu, for more information. The title of today's Hinckley Forum is Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War. Today's guest is Christian Whitten, who is principal of DC International Advisory Group and has extensive experience with international business, finance, politics, and foreign policy issues. Christian is the author of Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War. Before joining DCIA, Mr. Whitten served as a U.S. State Department official from 2003 to 2009, first as a special advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, and then as a deputy special envoy and senior policy advisor on North Korean human rights and transnational issues. Before joining the State Department, Mr. Whitten worked as a senior associate for the corporate finance practice of KPMG LLP. He earned undergraduate degrees in history and economics from Tulane University and holds an MBA from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Mr. Whitten writes and speaks frequently about business and foreign policy issues, appears on the Fox News Channel, CNBC, CNN, BBC, and other networks. His articles have been published by the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time, Daily Caller, Huffington Post, and numerous other publications. Please join me in welcoming our guest. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. Pleased to be here at the Hinckley Institute. Yesterday I was speaking in Santa Barbara at a World Affairs Council up there, the Committee on Foreign Relations. It's a good crowd, a little bit on the older side, a lot of retirees, very nice people. A woman turned to me and said, "Young man, you look frightfully young. How old are you?" And she was shocked that I was a mere 39 years old, but it's nice to have the shoe on the other foot with most of you, and I appreciate the chance to come and talk to you here on campus. I think I'll just talk, not so much give you a full book report, but talk about some of the ideas that informed the book in Smart Power, just for a few minutes, and then we can get to the interactive part sooner rather than later. When I start out to write this, and a feeling I had in government, in being a political appointee in the Bush administration at the State Department during times that were fairly politicized. You had the Afghan war going on, as it still is today. You had the Iraq war, dealing with transnational issues, as we did in our office, things like governance, democracy, Kyoto, climate change, etc. Sort of forming an opinion that we had a missing middle. In fact, two missing middles. A missing middle in statecraft and a missing middle, I think, in the politics of national security. Missing middle in statecraft. You see it today, and I think it started really quite early after the end of the Cold War. It started, I think, with the Gulf War. And it makes sense, I think, that the Gulf War, the 1991 Gulf War, really informs the way a lot of Americans think about power in the world, because it was, first of all, the first conflict after the Cold War. It was also the first successful conflict, depending on what you consider success, really since World War II. In effect, Korea ended with a stalemate, and Vietnam ended with a loss, and here was a war that lasted a very short period of time, and that was successful beyond even the wildest dreams of its most vocal advocates. And one problem, if you will, with the Gulf War, at least from an academic point of view, is how quickly things happened. You had Saddam Hussein, who invaded Kuwait, a U.S. ally, a major supplier of oil, threatening Saudi Arabia, another ally and a major supplier of oil. The effects on an economy at that point, which was already in recession, were immediately felt. The decision was made with broad support in Washington to dispatch the U.S. military to Saudi Arabia to prevent a further move south. What was controversial was whether we we would fight to liberate Kuwait, how far we would take the fight into Iraq, et cetera, and America was still beset with a view from Vietnam that the use of the military was a very risky thing, a very iffy thing. And the problem with that, if you are looking at this from my perspective, where I think there are a number of things that should take place between diplomacy, or that can take place between diplomacy, the most routine of meetings between diplomats, garden parties, that sort of thing, and actual kinetic war operations, is that the clock was ticking very loudly from the beginning of that crisis. You had the economy, you had the expense of the military in the field, you have a political cycle which, even though we say we don't like politics and electioneering and elections to interfere with national security, inevitably they do. There really is nothing more political than war, the decision to go to war, what your goals are in war. And so with that conflict, there was never really an opportunity or a chance to do things like build a dissent movement against Saddam Hussein, to use economic tools beyond the very blunt tool of sanctions applied to an entire economy. Certain tools at that time weren't appreciated as they are today. The power we have with the US dollar as the reserve currency, the power that can inflict on an adversary if you fence them off from the dollar-denominated economy. That's something we've gotten wiser to with North Korea and Iran. None of the Cold War techniques we used against communism, like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an effort to invigorate people who actually had a voice in a debate against an adversary. Today we talk about Islam and we just sort of scratch the surface. We talk about moderate Islam and fundamental Islam, but we really have never gotten to the point where we're willing to recognize there's an ideological conflict out there in the world, one that we want to influence, one that we have virtually no voice in, one that sending diplomats speaking in English from behind podiums will not influence at all. And unfortunately, I think if you go back to the Gulf War, that's really where it started. It was sort of one of actually the downside of success beyond what people expected. And you see this now today. You see this in the Syria debate. And I come from a center-right perspective. I'm sure you're all conservative Republicans, right? But I do come from a center-right background in my approach to statecraft. But I think both sides are wrong in Washington. And if you see it on Syria, we see it again. What's the debate? The debate is whether we should have a peace conference, whether we should try to bring the warring parties together, which sounds nice, but I think when you find that none of these parties currently has an incentive to stop fighting, to seek peace, to say this is good enough. Or at the far other end of the spectrum was to start bombing Syria, to have a no-fly zone, or the president's plan, which was aborted, to attack with limited number of cruise missiles and other standoff weapons. And you see it with Iran today, that the debate, and this is something the White House has made abundantly clear that they see the world this way today, that you will either engage in negotiations that begin with concessions to Iran, negotiations that have been panned by both parties in Congress, or you are in favor of war. But there are a tremendous number of things that you can do in the middle of that, I argue, that frankly aren't on the table. Iran is the chief and the major defender, advocate, spreader of the Islamist political ideology. They essentially were the first major nation state to be Islamist, the first one that was significant on the world stage with their 1979 revolution. There's a dissent movement inside Iran. A lot of people are not on board, especially a lot of young people, not on board with the vision of unifying mosque and state, of having a dictatorship, of the economic and cultural and political malaise that has caused. We could be doing things as we have in the past to support those in Iran that seek freedom. But that not only is something that this administration, the Obama administration, has refused to do, it's also something that the opposition in Washington hasn't even seriously contemplated, hasn't explained how you could do. And there are many things in our heritage, both Republican and Democrat, that we could draw on. Presidents of both parties, President Truman, President Kennedy, but also President Reagan, who have looked at this missing middle part of statecraft and brought it to bear. So that's basically what I was trying to get at in the book and in this topic of smart power. And just to make this a little more interesting, maybe a little more controversial, wanted to drill down on some things in the news and address it from a smart power perspective. two features of smart power. I think there are a lot. There are economic things, there are cultural things, legal things, financial things, technological things. But two major parts of smart power, I'd argue, are espionage and political warfare. And the two are related. But if espionage is the pull of information that our adversaries don't want us to have, political warfare is the push of ideas and people and events that our enemies and our adversaries would rather not contend with. Just to give one more example, I think one of the best and most harmful instances of political warfare in history, at least in modern history, was something the Germans did to Russia in World War I. It's very clever. There was a tremendous amount of dissent. The Romanov dynasty that ran Russia leading into World War I, during World War I, was hated. Brutal, repressive, incompetent, terrible economy, famines, etc. But the problem was a lot of the people, at least the problem from the German perspective, was the people who hated it rallied around Mother Russia for the war. And that wasn't supposed to happen. You wanted the dissidents to be dissidents and undercut your enemy in war. So they found a man who was at that point in exile, hanging out in Switzerland, who could see the situation uniquely, especially helpful from the German point of view, and to see it as more imperative to disrupt the government, not to rally around the flag, to bring about revolution, even though it would make you weaker in the face of a foreign enemy. And that person was Vladimir Lenin. And the Germans saw to it that he got put on a special train from Switzerland through Germany to Russia at a critical point of the war when support was at a very low point. And as soon as Lenin got to Russia, he set about correcting the views of revolutionaries there, that it was not the correct thing to do to rally around the flag, in that case in the war. And he was successful. They deposed the government. There were a few steps. I'm giving you the short version here. But the effect was to take Russia out of the war and to form a peace between Russia and Germany, crucial point in World War I that was highly favorable to the Germans. So that is the type of political warfare, and of course that's an extreme example that I think we don't want to replicate necessarily in that form, but to frame our minds around ways you can shape foreign events without actually killing people, without actually going to war. There's always going to be a fundamental role in statecraft for a military, not just how you use a military in war, but how you constitute it in peace, where you place it, what its policies are, how you, what systems you have. But I think there's this tremendous area in the middle that we're missing. So that's the political warfare part. If you look at the intelligence part, that draw of information, this is a part where I'm afraid that the American public may have too high of an impression of what we're capable of. And in government, I worked on a number of issues in countries, but toward the end focused a lot on North Korea. And you see how limited our information and our abilities are to understand what truly is going on in a foreign situation that matters for our interests. With North Korea, if you look at our major trading partners, Japan, Korea, China, huge trading partners, and if you look at the area they can now threaten, which is really all of the North Pacific, it's a tremendous area of importance to the U.S., but our ability to get a handle on that is extremely limited. And I can give you two examples where the American public has been led to believe, along with quiet support from these intelligence agencies, that our intelligence capabilities far exceed what they actually do. If you go and look at the early days of the Libyan Civil War, you'll see anonymous accounts linked to newspapers, almost invariably the New York Times or the Washington Post, from unnamed sources high in the intelligence bureaucracy. And the word at that point was, well, there are already intelligence operatives on the ground, and they are talking about how we're going to arm the Libyan rebels and how we're going to coordinate action between NATO air power once it's brought to bear and fighting on the ground. Well, fast forward several months through the war, and especially after a friendly fire incident where an Allied plane accidentally bombed some rebels, and there was a question put to the NATO command, well, why don't you have better communications with the rebels on the ground? And he not only said that we don't have communications with the rebels, we don't have air-ground coordination, he said it's not in our mission to do that. This is supposed to be a humanitarian intervention, whatever that is. There are also other instances where you see the rebels trying to communicate during the war with an American military attaché all the way in Stuttgart, Germany, just by using the telephone or by using Skype on a computer. So clearly, no air-ground coordination ever set up. I also was in touch personally with a number of people who were, small number of people who were involved with matters on the ground in Libya, and foreign diplomats whose countries had a serious stake in what was going on. And not that that would have necessarily given me knowledge of what was being done by our spies if they were there, but they saw no indication either of U.S. involvement on the ground. Now, you can say that that's good or bad, but this is an instance, and it was again repeated with Syria, where early in a conflict, the intelligence community lets you think that they are on the ground, involved, and have the matter at hand, ready to take control. And in reality, it's just not so. And that's a shame, because if you believe in a world where American power needs to be powerful, or we need to have an oar in the water to influence events, and ideally do so without the very blunt tools of broad sanctions or warfare, then you should be of the mind that we need intelligence capabilities. And unfortunately, I don't think we have those today. And now to fast forward a bit to the other side of intelligence, which is probably the most controversial. It's in the news. It's going to be in the news again tomorrow with President Obama's announcement about his plans for the NSA and for our intelligence practices. The NSA and the idea of eavesdropping has been controversial. And just a couple of comments on that. First, I'd like to argue for the importance of signals intelligence, and that's what we're talking about, eavesdropping, snooping. Some people say we should be completely out of that business. Organizations like WikiLeaks have argued that we've entered a new age. We've passed a meridian in time. The secrets business is gone. But the problem is that the bad guys and even our allies haven't gotten that message. The need to gather information, to understand what our adversaries are thinking, and also to understand what our allies are thinking. Take, for example, the issue of wiretapping Angela Merkel, the German chancellor's cell phone. I don't know if we're doing that, but I sort of hope we do, because if the Chancellor of Germany is unwise enough to say sensitive things into a cell phone, no matter how much her people think that is secure, it is not. And what she's saying into her cell phone is undoubtedly being intercepted by the Chinese and the Russians. So I think we should know as much about the government of Germany, which is frankly more critical to our interests than to Russia or China. We need to know as much as at least they do. And we need to know about things before we read about them, in this case in Spiegel or in whatever issue. That's sort of the foreign case. But then think in your own personal lives. And I think a lot of statecraft actually, we sort of set aside what we know from life in order to practice statecraft, especially the PhDs, the experts, the Council on Foreign Relations folks. But actually, countries and people act similarly in statecraft as they do in life. And think about the way you gather confidential or privileged information in your daily lives. Information about your family members, information about your school, information about your fraternity or your class or your team. You gather it by confidence, by having a situation where sources can tell you things and they could be reasonably assured that you're not going to turn around and put it on Facebook immediately, that it's not going to become public. And so this is, I think a fundamental fact of life that's often lost when you have people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and Private Bradley Manning now in prison, saying that, again, the secrets business is over, that we can now be much more transparent, that information ought to be free. That, to me, is a recipe for having a government that's blind, deaf, and dumb. If we believe in peace and security, we need to have these capabilities. So I think that we can make changes. The reality today, more than a decade after 9/11, is a different reality than what we faced, say, the month after 9/11 when the Patriot Act was passed. And I think it's fair to say that the intent of Congress in passing the Patriot Act was not to have the NSA snooping or looking at metadata on the phone calls of 150 million Americans. But within that debate, which I think is a smart debate, we still nonetheless need to realize that there's an important part of intelligence. And actually, if you don't like war and you don't like foreign surprises and you don't like abusing foreign populations because of the misconduct of their government, then you should be in favor of strong intelligence capabilities. Now, just to wrap up, one thing with smart power, I also argue, it's not just a list of things you can do. It's not just a bunch of bureaus like the CIA, like the NSA, like the Directorate of National Intelligence that need to be fixed. And I do talk at length about problems I think we have at the State Department, we had at the State Department. But it's also a way of thinking. It's a way of being strategic. Let's go back briefly to the Syria debate and the Syria war, where, again, I'd argue both sides are wrong. I think my side was wrong, at least people who most visibly represent my side, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, in Congress, by just calling willy-nilly for a no-fly zone. And there's a pattern here. After the 1991 Gulf War, John McCain called for a no-fly zone. After the wars in the Balkans in the late 90s, John McCain called for a no-fly zone. Libyan civil war, John McCain calls for a no-fly zone. And then with Syria, you guessed it, a no-fly zone. And a no-fly zone, to me, is problematic because it's not a strategy. It might be a tactic, it might be a feature of a strategy, but if you had one over Syria, a no-fly zone, or a limited mission to lob some Tomahawk missiles, what does that get you? Who wins? Who loses? Does it really help the rebels? What if it helps Assad by making him look resilient? If it does help the rebels, who among the rebels does it help? Does it help the dwindling numbers of secular defectors from Assad's military? Does it help the Islamists who are Syrians, or does it help the foreign Islamists like Al-Qaeda that seem increasingly to have influence over the course of that country and that revolution? I think it's important to have a starting point, and this can be Statecraft 101 or Smart Power 101. It's a simple question of who you want to win, who do you want to lose? If you can't have someone win or lose, who do you want to make life harder for, and who do you want to help out? I define what I think are the three primary threats we face today, because a problem I think we've had in both parties in Washington is a failure to speak clearly about what the threats are and what the threats are not. You know, you have people playing to populism. Well, if I support the no-fly zone, I appear to be having a solution and doing something for this humanitarian tragedy. But I'm not saying who I want to win. I think the three primary threats we face are two nation states and one political movement. And the two nation states, the two governments, are China and Iran. And the movement is Islamism. With China, it seems pretty clear. I mean, they've been involved now for 2 decades in a headlong military buildup that's unexplained. There's no one who might plausibly invade Chinese territory. But it's not just the military buildup. It's a cyber war that's waged against us every day, probing us for the day that they may decide to wage a cyber Pearl Harbor. They also have disputes with every single one of their maritime neighbors, many of which are U.S. allies. They also challenge the U.S. Navy and are pretty clear that they would like us out of the first island chains in the Western Pacific and possibly out of all of the Western Pacific, which wouldn't just be a blow to our pride, but in fact would put all of the trade from Northeast Asia and all of the trade that comes through the Malacca Strait, which includes most of the oil that comes from the Middle East, but also things that are a lot more important, at the mercy of a government that sees itself as our chief adversary and the next superpower in the world. With Iran, this is a government I think that, and I'm not alone in this, and Republicans aren't alone in this. This is a number of Democrats feel this way too, that you have a government that has seen itself basically at war with us since 1979, whether we realize that or not. They have an ideology. I mean, they are, long before bin Laden was around, they were the ones who believed in unifying mosque and state. They were the ones who believed in hijacking a religion, Islam, and making it a political ideology. There were some before them, certainly, and this is not a new thing in the world, but they were the first to achieve in a nation state that model. And, it's not just from the beginning when they took American diplomats hostage, or at least students did with the consent of that government. But fast forward to the 1980s, where they killed and captured a number of Americans in places like Lebanon. Fast forward to the 90s, where they blew up military barracks in Saudi Arabia, which they had also done in the 1980s, American military barracks. Fast forward to the last decade, where they are responsible for a startling number of the Americans who died and were maimed in Iraq, which is a story that to this day goes unreported. And then just last year, Iranian operatives were caught planning a mass casualty assassination in Washington, D.C. Luckily, the people whom they thought were Mexican drug cartel operatives who could stage this attack were in fact DEA agents. But that shows the clear intent, I think, of this government to strike us directly here in the homeland. And unfortunately, on both left and right, Iran is often talked of as just a threat to Israel. And Israel may be the canary in the coal mine, but ultimately, I think it's us with our classically liberal way of life, our freedom, our ability to choose religions, to move between them if you like, to practice them as we see fit. All of that is inherently alien to the model that they have on offer. And then the final threat is very much linked to Iran, as I said. It's Islamism. It is that political ideology. And the Iranians aren't just the advocate, they aren't the only advocates, but you see it elsewhere. Of course, in the Middle East, we saw it with Al-Qaeda, you still see it today, but also groups that aren't outright terrorists, like the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is a problem. The administration I served in after 9/11, I think understandably declared a war on terror. You're going to war. It's one that we had no idea we were going to fight. And you're looking for all the allies you can get, domestically and abroad. So, certainly it wasn't a war on Islam. We knew that. Most Muslims have absolutely no desire to strap on a suicide belt or to wage violent jihad. And most don't necessarily want to impose their way of life on other people. So clearly it's not a war on Islam, and you kind of want to avoid things that are like that, so we'll call it a war on terror, which is fine, I think, for the short term. But the tragedy is we never evolved beyond that, and that our intelligence bureaucracy, our government bureaucracy, our policy bureaucracy, these spiraling, mushrooming organizations in Washington, more people who are supposed to be getting the executive branch and getting our congressmen smarter, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars spent on those bureaucracies. And with all of this, with all of this supposed knowledge and information, our $80 billion a year intelligence community never bringing in a real perspective on what was going on, which is it wasn't a war on terror. Or a terror is a means. That would be like calling World War II a war on buzz bombs or kamikazes or U-boats. There's something behind the terror. And in World War II, behind Blitzkrieg was the German army. And in the Cold War, behind the occupation by the Red Army of Eastern Europe and Soviet domination was communism as an ideology that animated the Soviet Union, that justified it to itself and to the people it was repressing and gave it force. But we never made that logical conclusion, I don't think, with what came on 9/11 and subsequently. And that is, what is the force that animates the Iranian government, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, all of these groups, whether they're waging active jihad or fielding an army, or just engaging in political subversion, assassinating people in Lebanon, or doing what Hezbollah does in Lebanon, which isn't just assassinating people, but everything down to social services, providing cooking oil and things like that to average Lebanese. And that is, I believe, the Islamist ideology. And once you recognize that that's the enemy, you can get to thinking about smart ways to combat it, ways that, again, that I think are more artful than American diplomats going abroad, professing our tolerance, saying that we respect Muslims, all of which is true, but all of which is fundamentally ineffective on people within Islam who are contemplating which way they want to go. Do they believe in Islamism? Do they believe in reconstituting the caliphate? Do they believe that we are the great Satan? Or do they think that Islam is better as a religion if it's separated from government, which is, of course, what we found with Christianity and Judaism, that if you separate church and state or mosque and state, it actually makes both better. But I can't be the one making that argument. We need better voices in the debate. And also, if your policy is to make life hard on Iran and China, and especially on Islamism, then when the Arab Spring comes along, it won't be so hard to come up with a strategy. And I'd argue we don't really have a strategy toward the Middle East right now. But if you have it in your mind that, well, who knows if we can defeat Islamism, and who knows what we can do to it. But we know we want to make life hard for it, and we know we want to make life easier for those who are against it. Well, then you're going to see young protesters in Tahrir Square who are not the Taliban and who are not calling for Islamist rule. They're not in favor of even the Muslim Brotherhood, which was really founded in Egypt and has considered Egypt home base for so long. You would want to make life easier for them. You would want to ease their path to power, help them overtly, covertly, however is necessary, because liberals are always going to be less well organized at the beginning than their tyrannical opponents. That was true with communism. Go back to the early days of the Cold War. Communists are nothing if not well organized. Party order was sort of one of the most fundamental bedrock principles. And if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, they survived for decades through repression and remained organized and remained viable. There were people in Washington who thought that they would give up on that ideology when they got power, which didn't happen and probably could have been presumed not likely when it did come about. Also, if you had in mind that Islamism as a political ideology was a problem, when the Syria civil war comes along, again, your task would be easier. So you wouldn't be spinning your wheels saying, well, gee, we don't like Assad and Assad must go, but we don't know if we want to support this other group of people. Well, it would have been fairly, I think, simple to conclude when Syria came along, we should support the secular defector from Assad's army, even if they are not Andrew or Alexander Hamilton style Democrats, even if they're not going to turn the place into Beverly Hills. Nonetheless, we should be on their side and be against Assad, which was Iran's ally, and also be against the foreign jihadists, Al-Qaeda, that have come in. So, at any rate, that's the general gist of things, the way I see them and the way I try and lay them out in the book. I do end on an optimistic note in the book. I hope I haven't scared you with doom and gloom. And I do think there is a reason for optimism. You know, Winston Churchill famously said that Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I do think if you look at our past, we have it in our capacity to reform ourselves, to finally sort of awaken to foreign threats and to fight them smartly and not just with blunt force, although with blunt force if necessary. So that's the general thought. If you have any questions, I'd love to take them. Let me just wait for that.
So just state your name and say a little bit about yourself.
I'm Paul. I'm from Park City. And smart power implies the opposite, dumb power. And I'm, like most people in the room, you know, with an ongoing fascination about what would the solution be with our involvement with Iran, how to prevent serious destruction that they're becoming capable of. So I think of how dumb power leads us to what is smart power with Iran. I go back to 1954, according to declassified CIA documents. You had an elected president, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had legitimate grievances against British Petroleum and the British government. The UN did not support Mossadegh. The Eisenhower administration and John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, we in effect took out an elected president. This led to, arguably, a backlash of the Islamic Revolution, which was a backlash as a result of our government and the British government installing the Shah of Iran, notably corrupt, hated by his people. These people were understandably angry with the meddling done by two great powers. So then you have the Islamic Revolution, the creature known as the Ayatollah Khomeini. We empower Saddam Hussein, made him the sixth biggest power in the world, because an enemy of an enemy is our friend. 1 million people died in a stalemate with the Iraqis and the Iranians, and all the mess that came out of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and the mess that just fast forward. So I'm wondering, I would appreciate to hear, now we're in a mess that we helped create by dumb power. Okay, we didn't act alone, but still, big architect involvement here. What would smart power be now, from your point of view, the author of Smart Power?
Right. No, that's a very good question. And you've centered on what is the chief argument basically against what I argue for, which is that when you do things like this, when you intervene in political affairs abroad, that there are unintended consequences. And certainly that was an unintended consequence. The unpleasantness that followed the I don't want to be seen as a big defender of Ajax, which was the CIA operation that helped depose Mossadegh. But there was a very good reason for it, which was that he, though elected, was, and in the history they call him erratic and a number of other things, but it was thought that he was taking, you can argue against this too, that he was thought to be taking Iran in a direction that would lead it behind the Iron Curtain. And that it was...
Wouldn't that be their prerogative?
No, I would argue it wouldn't.
We call him a communist, but he was elected by his people.
Right. No, and this was the argument. I think it's a very good point. I think you need to weigh our interests, and our interests aren't the be-all and end-all, but with critical instances where our security is on the line, I think we do have the right to intervene. And if you go back and look at 1954, it was a very scary time. I mean, Stalin had been dead 1 year. There was still political turmoil in the Soviet Union. Berlin was in crisis, as it was frequently. It would be in crisis again, even in the early 60s. The thought was not if there would be a general war with the Soviet Union, but when. And also this was on the heels, it was a couple of years later, but for example, of what was seen as losing China, that because we hadn't taken forceful, decisive action, that the United States had lost China as an ally and it had gone communist, and also now it was on its way to a nuclear capability. So this was a very scary, very dangerous world where people were expecting World War III, and again, not if, but when. So in that mindset, it was judged that we cannot let this most important government in the Middle East glide behind the Iron Curtain, and Mossadegh was in league with communists. Now, I think it's a fair argument to say, oh, but hey, he was democratically elected, and that was an argument that's used more recently with Morsi, the deposed president of Egypt, he was given about a year to hang himself, frankly, and was deposed by the Egyptian military. But from the point of view of U.S. interests in our security, I don't think we can just sit by and say that we let democracy run its course and let governments and countries that are friendly become enemies.
What was our interest with Iran in 1954 other than oil?
Oil's a big interest. It was then. It's less so today, thankfully, because of energy development here in North America. But even without oil, we can't then, and I certainly can't today, ignore political developments in the Middle East because our oceans just don't protect us anymore. Threats that emerge from there, I think, end up here, and they end up here rapidly.
Yeah, can we go ahead? Sorry.
No, it's fine. No, and I'll answer quickly. I think we fundamentally see things differently. I think that the CIA did do the right thing, and I think that was an instance of smart power. There are other reasons that led to the 1979 revolution, and the Shah at that point was not necessarily the Shah we saw later. The repression grew greater. And again, there are other things you could have done. You've cited an example where a military government went from bad to worse. There are other instances where military governments that we supported, loathsome regimes that we supported, went from worse to much better. If you look at Taiwan and its military government, blossoming into a free democracy. South Korea, basket case. People looked at that today after the Korean War like we look at Iraq. This place is falling apart. Why the hell did we spend 33,000 American lives there? And yet over time it grew from a repressive one-party military state into a democracy. Spain was another. They were neutral in World War II, but partial to the Nazis, run by Franco, the dictator. But we brought him into NATO. We dealt with him because the big primary enemy at the time was Soviet communism, and over time that government also went in the right direction. So unfortunately it would be great if we could take a long view, and I think you should. But there are so many variables that cannot be foreseen, and I think if you have an overwhelming threat today, then sometimes you have to make that decision to partner with loathsome regimes, but when it's necessary.
My question's not nearly as argumentative, and I'd like to preface it with a little story. I have an acquaintance in 2008, 2009. She's a saddle maker in Colorado. She made a saddle for a member of the bin Laden family, not Osama's. He, was estranged from the member of the family that she made the saddle for. Fast forward to 9/11, we're bombed. Within a week, she was detained for 10 days by our national government and questioned about her association with the bin Laden family. Now, you mentioned that the NSA is more powerful now. Are they truly more powerful, or do we just hear more about it?
That's an excellent question. The specific answer is I don't know. There were provisions of the Patriot Act which did make it easier to do what they do now, and they certainly have a much larger budget than they did back then. And I don't believe in suspending the Fourth Amendment. I do think we have a right against unreasonable search and seizure. I don't like the idea of, I'm sure it'll mean jobs in Utah, but I don't like the idea of the NSA storing information that they haven't gotten a search warrant for. If it's about U.S. citizens, I'm fine tracking foreign threats. So, I mean, I think that phone companies should be told to retain information, and that if an American citizen is suspected of contacting a terrorist group or an enemy, then that information can be obtained. You know, I think President Bush put it well, and this is how he understood things, even if things have gotten off track in some respects, which is if you're talking to Al-Qaeda, we want to know why. I wouldn't favor detaining someone without probable cause for that period of time. I mean, habeas corpus still applies. The Fourth Amendment still applies. You have a right to an attorney, et cetera. But I think it's also important to point out that the NSA is also not as lawless as it's being made out in the press. They are following either written laws or interpretations that have gone by a court. Now, you can argue that the FISA court is a kangaroo court and we want a real court. That's fine. That's a legitimate argument. I'd agree with parts of that. I'd agree with that in some instances and not others. You also find that of the revelations that have come from Snowden and the information he stole from the NSA, there is nothing that shows us spying on citizens or politicians from Great Britain or Australia or Canada or New Zealand. And that's because we have no spy agreements with those countries. After World War II, regions were allocated to those English-speaking democracies, and all of whom were close allies of the United States in the war. And we share signals intelligence, and because of that intelligence integration, we also have, and for other reasons, because they're allies, we have no spy agreements. So I see an NSA that fundamentally is following the rules that has been set by it by either Congress or by interpretations of successive administrations. So I don't see a rogue agency or a lawless agency. I see an agency that could perhaps use a different set of directions, since the reality of today is different than it was a month after 9/11. But sorry, long answer to your question.
Hi, my name's Courtney, and I just wanted to ask, you talked a lot about like the war on Islam, and when you talk about such a broad category of like a whole religion, how do you separate the bad people within the religion and the religion itself, which is usually not harmful?
Right, right. No, I think it's important in dealing with the threat. You know, so often the terms we use are just moderate Islam and fundamental Islam, and I think that really misses the boat, because if you are a fundamental Muslim living in Anatolia and you treat women like dirt, and not that all fundamentalist Muslims do that, but if you have a view of the world that I wouldn't agree with and a view of man and his relation to God that I don't agree with, nonetheless, if you are not harming anyone and if you are not engaged in political or active warfare, then I don't think we need to be that concerned with those people. I wouldn't want to spend a Friday night with them, but that is, that is someone who might be fundamentalist who is of no interest. On the other hand, if you would appear to be a moderate Muslim, say if you're a member of the Council of American Islamic Relations up lobbying Capitol Hill, you have no beard, you treat women nicely, you believe in modernity, you profess an agreement with our American form of freedom, but nonetheless, if you essentially are advocating a cross-pollination of religion and politics, if you want a union of mosque and state in the same way that there was a union between Christendom and governments in Europe in the last millennium, then I think that's when it becomes concerning. So judging, people who have made that crossover, who believe in political Islamism, who believe in that unity, who believe in recreating a caliphate, who believe in Sharia as the form of law and as the source of law, rather than civilly enacted law, democratically enacted law. I think those are the people we have to be concerned with, and you apply different degrees of concern depending on how much of a threat they pose and how active they are. But that's the distinction I would make between Islam and Islamism.
I guess
So I'll ask a question if that's okay. My name's Emily. I'm a student here at the U studying political science. And just given your background at the White House and all the experiences you've shared in foreign policy and politics, what advice would you give to students like most of us here that are interested in a career in foreign policy or politics?
Well, it's a good question. I have to disclaim that I'm not the best person to ask because I was a political appointee. I was actually in business, thought of government and politics as something for much later in life, and then after 9/11 wanted to be part of what was going on then and there. There are many fine agencies and many fine Americans working for them. I critique a lot of them, most of them, in my book. I think a lot have gotten off of what their initial mission is. And, government organizations, just like private ones, need to be refocused on new goals and new missions as things change. But nonetheless, there are a lot of opportunities within them. When people told me they're interested in the State Department and the Foreign Service, I would often suggest actually going to the CIA. And again, I'm a critic of the CIA. But the requirements are just as significant. The chance to live abroad, work out of an embassy, do things like that if you're an operations officer are very similar, but you get to work on things that are more significant and affect and reach people that are higher in government. So that's of the limited advice I can give, having never really walked that path, it would be along those lines. Then there are the obvious ones that you've all heard of, which are language skills. And again, here I am preaching what I don't practice. I speak English and maybe a tiny bit of Peggy Hill Spanish, which you may remember. Anyone watch King of the Hill? It's in reruns now, but yeah. So terrible Spanish and a tiny bit of English. But foreign skills. And if you're interested in something that's useful to the government, obviously you look at languages where we face considerable threats, especially if they're communities that don't exist in large numbers in the United States. So Arabic, obviously, in a huge demand after 9/11 and still to an extent. And then, of course, for business, the one thing with business I would say, it's sort of thought, oh, I'm interested in China, I should learn Chinese, and that's great. But if it's a situation where the United States, where our businesses are so heavily involved, actually, there's the risk that you're competing against native speakers, and I would look at a different region or a different language. So, as a younger man, I thought, and this is before government, maybe I want to go be an investment banker and maybe in Hong Kong. Well, to be an investment banker, even for a Western iBank in Hong Kong, you not only need to speak Cantonese, which is the local dialect, but also Mandarin, which is the mainland's version of Chinese for the most part, and you need to speak it as a native. So it'd be very difficult from someone from our background to do that. So just a couple of thoughts, again, from someone who's a hypocrite on the issue.
Please join me in thanking Christian for an excellent and informative forum.
Thank you.